Welcome, everybody, to Productive Conflict. Transform destructive conflict into productive conflict. Don't let conflict grind you down. Our presenter today is Paul McMurray. For more than 25 years, Paul has helped leaders assess their organizations, develop their strategic plans, and implement change initiatives. He has worked with boards of directors and senior leadership teams to create compelling visions and strategic goals. He has worked with all levels of management to help align their goals and daily tasks with leadership's strategic vision. Part of what makes Paul effective is his ability to create a safe environment for holding difficult conversations. Paul has extensive background in training and development. He is a master certified trainer representing 5 different training companies in their programs and is also an ICF certified executive coach. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul McMurray.
Hi, good morning. I am delighted to be here and really grateful for this opportunity to talk about productive conflict and transforming destructive conflict into productive conflict. Just yesterday, I had an experience with my children as we were gathering around talking about the various aspects of wearing masks or not wearing masks. And boy, I'm telling you, it turned a nice Sunday afternoon into a very, very frustrating experience when the group could not agree on whether masks worked or didn't work. And boy, sometimes it can truly grind you up. And what I'd like to do today is talk about conflict and talk about some of the automatic thoughts that happen with our conflict and the responses that come, the destructive responses that can really kind of eat us and really in many ways just drain us of our energy, and how we can take that and transform that into a productive response. And then lastly, there's going to be an opportunity at the end of this session for you to experience the productive assessment, the productive conflict assessment. So let's get right in and let's talk about what conflict is. Conflict, here are some definitions. Situations with conditions, practices, or goals are different between participants. They're inherently incompatible. That's sort of the academic version. Then we have the Thomas Kilmann version, which is conflict is any situation in which your desires differ from those of another person. And then lastly, the difference of opinions involving strong emotions comes from the productive conflict literature. So let me acknowledge right up front that conflict can be nuanced. It can be politically sensitive. I mean, people's interests may truly be opposed, and roles and levels of authority may not be correctly defined or delineated. And there could be real incentives to compete rather than collaborate. So I'm not here trying to say that this is a simple pill that we can take to resolve conflict, but I do believe and have witnessed this process that can take the destructive nature of conflict and really transform it and the outcomes into something very, very productive. So I'd like to start with your situation. I'd like to challenge you to think about a time when you were in serious conflict with somebody. And I've given you a handout. It's a 5-page handout. On page 1, you'll see at the top of that there's a place for you to jot down what the circumstances were around the conflict that you're experiencing. If you can jot that down, and then in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, either paste that or a small portion of that, and let us see what your conflict was. So give you a second to fill that in, and then put it in the chat, and we'll go in just a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds. Okay, so thank you for jotting something down. I'd like to share with you an example of where I witnessed firsthand the wonderful nature of transforming destructive conflict into productive conflict. So here's the situation. I was working with a high-tech company with extremely smart IT engineers. who design sophisticated solutions for their clients. And before they present to their clients, they need to present their findings to a group of leaders and peers in the company. And so in the Q&A that follows their formal presentation, the engineers often became defensive and argumentative. And inevitably, somebody would pose the question, why did you choose option A instead of option B? And it was in this moment that the leader saw something happen with the engineers. And it's in that moment where we have choices that we can make. And so I'll tell you more about that as we move forward. So one of the things that happened was that the leaders kind of said, okay, it's not our problem, it's their problem. And so we want all these engineers to get training on communication skills prior to the next time they have to present. We won the contract, taught the class. Along with the teaching the class came the opportunity to coach these engineers. Prior to coaching them, I was able to interview about 15 engineers to get their perspective on the situation. So here's what was really interesting was we noticed that the engineers did admit that they became defensive and argumentative. And this is what we would call destructive responses. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a clip here for just a moment. It'll be a simple clip on what happens in our minds to lead us to these destructive responses. So let's take a look at this clip.
Yelling, caving in, gossiping. Whether it's a brief dispute or a lingering issue, we've all done things in conflict that we're not proud of. We know they don't help, so why do we do them? What's actually powering these responses? Let's take a closer look. Hidden inside is a thought, often unconscious. Psychologists call this an automatic thought. It just pops into our heads. Usually, we don't even know we're thinking it. Take these two, for example. They're in a meeting and she interrupts him. His automatic thought might be, she's trying to make me look stupid. And because it's automatic, he doesn't even think to challenge it. Instead, he gets angry and lashes out with a sarcastic response. So here's one way to look at unproductive conflict. There's an event, the interruption. We have an automatic thought, she's trying to make me look stupid. And there's a destructive response, in this case, sarcasm. And so, to make conflict more productive, the first step is to understand both this, your automatic thought, and this, your destructive response.
Okay, so what did we see here? We basically saw the concept of we enter into conflict, it drives an automatic thought. And oftentimes this automatic thought is just an instinct to protect ourselves in the conflict. And so this automatic thought pops into our head, and regardless of how rational we think we are, it can lead to these knee-jerk responses, what we call the destructive responses, that we don't even think about, and then sometimes the responses we certainly may regret later. And so as we look at this path that the engineers went down, the first thing that happened was that they were asked a question, and in this particular situation, they were asked the question, why did you choose option A over option B? And their automatic thoughts all of a sudden came in. They think I chose the wrong solution. They're challenging me. They're questioning my integrity. They're disrespecting the amount of work that I put in on this project. And I hope you hear the intonation of my voice, because that's exactly what it sounded like when I was interviewing these engineers is even talking about them got them more and more agitated. So is it any wonder that they had these destructive responses of being defensive, argumentative, snapping back at questions, that their tone of voice changed, their body posture changed, and they got shorter and shorter answers. This is the nature of destructive responses. So what was the impact to the engineers? Like this pencil sharpener. This pencil sharpener can be used to sharpen pencils to a nice point where we can distinguish things and we can write clearly and produce something nice and clean, or it can grind it up to almost the point where the pencil is useless. And these engineers felt completely frustrated, angry, unappreciated, and ultimately ground up by this experience. So now I'd like to take you into your thinking back to your conflict situation. So on page 1, you were able to write down, you hopefully jotted down something about what your conflict was. And now I'd like you to look at the next box on page 1, and that is, what were you thinking about the situation and or the other people involved in this? So take a moment and jot something down there. And then once you've done that, I'd like you to think about, what was the impact of your behavior, either on you or the situation? What was the impact? So take a moment and just jot something down in those 2 boxes. To help you think about your destructive responses, I've got a list here. This list is also on page 3 in your handout. I'd like you to look at these words, and in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, share with us 1 or 2 of those destructive responses that you've either used or experienced in your conflict situations. So if you wouldn't mind just typing some stuff in the chat, then on page 3 in your handout, you can go back if you'd like to and check boxes of those that you have used or experienced in conflict. Okay, thank you. So the last thing I'd like you to do on page 1 in your handout is I'd like you to jot down what was the impact of this conflict on you, record that in your handout, and then if you would in the chat, you can just answer, did it grind you up or sharpen you up? What one? And as you do that, you're not alone. I just want to stress that you are definitely not alone in our experiences around conflict. Okay, thank you. So now I want to pause for just a moment and talk about conflict and personality styles. As we think about personality styles, we have all sorts of assessments that we can take to find out what our personality styles are. And what is really important is, I'll probably state the obvious, is that how we respond to conflict can be impacted by our personality styles. An introvert may be very different in their automatic thoughts and responses than an extrovert. Or someone might really like a straightforward and to the point approach, while others might read that directness as having no empathy or caring for others. Research has shown that there is a strong relationship between personality traits and how conflict is addressed. This is not a ticket to use personality styles as an excuse for bad behavior. It's important that we understand our personality styles, and the styles of others so that they can help us turn this destructive conflict into productive conflict. So overlaying all this material is personality styles. And with that said, what I'd like to do is now take you further into the process of creating productive responses. There's a key point here. The key point is if you want to change the impact, you've got to change your response. And if you want to change your response, you've got to change your automatic thoughts. And with this, I'd like to share with you the second video here on how we can do that. So let's just take a look and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
So now you know about automatic thoughts and how they can sometimes get us into trouble during conflict. But the good news is we can disrupt this process and change our responses by stepping back and reframing. When we step back, we pull ourselves away from intense emotions like anger and anxiety that might be clouding our judgment. And we reframe by evaluating our automatic thoughts to see if there are other ways to think about the situation. So it looks a little something like this. Remember this guy? He got interrupted. And his automatic thought was, she's trying to make me look stupid. Then he got angry and lashed out with sarcasm. But let's rewind. What if this time, instead of letting his anger get the upper hand, he steps back from his emotions by acknowledging his automatic thought, and he reframes by challenging it. He asks himself, is that actually true? Am I overreacting or exaggerating the problem? Is there another way I could look at the situation? And yeah, most of the time he'll probably discover that there is a more realistic way to think about it. Instead of, she's trying to make me look stupid, he can look at this as, she was just focused on making her point. Or maybe, she probably didn't realize she cut me off. And now that he has a broader perspective, he can make an informed choice about how he wants to react. Maybe he wants to pull her aside and address the situation. Maybe he asks her to give him a moment to complete his thought. The point is, now he has a choice. And so, if we wanted to map the whole situation out, it goes something like this. An event triggers an automatic thought. But the trick is, here, we catch ourselves. We step back from our emotions, then we reframe our thoughts. And now, armed with this new perspective, we have our very best chance to resist those destructive responses and choose one that's actually productive.
Okay, so let's take a quick look, a quick review of this. Conflict generates an automatic thought, and what we need to do is instead of going down that sort of knee-jerk destructive reaction, we need to take a step back, rethink it. And our goal isn't to eliminate the thoughts because they're going to come. Our goal is to see what we can do to change the way we react to those thoughts. And that's what is very important here. So one of the ways we can do this is by stepping back and saying, wait a minute, is this actually true? Am I overreacting? Is there another way I could look at this situation? And then we can reframe it by saying, oh man, this situation's awful, but not the person I'm dealing with. Or, well, I don't like his positions. I should hear him out. These are the types of things that help us reframe. And then ultimately, we may end up apologizing or be a little more introspective in how we approach this. And so this completes the model of moving from destructive to productive response. So I'd like to take you back to the engineers and tell you what happened. It was absolutely, it was just so cool. So remember they were asked, why did you choose A over B? They have all this stuff going on in their heads. And their first thought was they are questioning my integrity, and then they start to step back. And in stepping back, instead of becoming defensive, they start to reframe it. And before you know it, they've started asking themselves this question. Perhaps they're being curious. perhaps they are just want to see how I work. And so instead of becoming defensive, they start reframing, and then all of a sudden their responses become more calm. They don't show agitation. They give reassurances on what they've done. They show flexibility in listening to the others as they have a give and take. And ultimately, they came. I had two people call me back, two engineers. I wish all more had done it. And they called me back and said it's the best presentation they've ever done. And they attributed it to not reading in judgments or questioning about their presentation. And that made all the difference to them. That transformed the destructive conflict into productive conflict. Now, I'd like to take this back to you. And I'd like to have you look at this. We're going to now look at page 2 of your handout. I'm going to take you through page 2 to get you to think about and then share with us some of your answers. So we got the conflict, we've got your automatic thoughts, and we have your destructive thoughts from actions from page 1. Now page 2. What questions could you ask to get you to think differently about the situation? As you remember, the engineers looked and said, so is this really valid? Are my concerns right? Are they really judging me? So that's the type of question to ask. Then the next piece would be, how could you reframe it? And for the engineers, they reframed it by saying, I think this is just curiosity. Here's the way I can think about this differently. They just want to see what I thought about A and B. It has nothing to do with being judged. And so if you could jot some things down in your handout on page 2 about what questions, and then how could you reframe that? And then lastly, if you start thinking about it differently, what responses could you use to respond to to the conflict? Is there something else you could do? And so in general, we have, I've given you a list in your handout of the productive responses, and you'll see those on page 4. And so if you would, you could look at those and say, okay, here's a whole list of productive responses. Some of them are difficult for me and some of them are easy for me. And it could be a simple apology. It could be being more flexible. Those might be the responses that you could use to move from destructive conflict to productive conflict. So now, if you would, please take a minute and just finish off your page 2, and then lastly, the impact. What's the impact that this could have on your conflict? So with that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to offer you an opportunity to experience the productive conflict assessment. And we have the wonderful opportunity to provide you free of charge the Everything DISC Productive Conflict Assessment. We have 50 of those that we can give away. And in order to do that, you're going to have to email me, Paul McMurray at findinsight.com, subject heading productive conflict, and we need to know some contact information about you. I will send those codes out to you with a link that you can take it. You'll be able to print out your own PDF. Within 2 weeks, those codes will basically kind of dissolve into be unusable. And then on May 17th, we're going to have a group debrief session for anybody who wants to learn more about that assessment. We invite you to attend, and we'll send that out for those who have completed the assessment. So let me just once again say thank you for being here. We're going to open this up for chat in just a moment, but I'd like to challenge you today for you to think about, how do you react in conflict and see if there are ways that you can implement the whole idea of stepping back and reframing so that you can transform productive or destructive conflict into productive conflict. So thank you very much.